reading, it is your signal to head out. Jackie is our chair of the eldership team, and I am so grateful for her fellowship and for all the elders as we together chart the course that God has for us. After the service, Jackie and the team will be ready to pray with people. Prayer is such an important value, and if you know that you need prayer or you just know that you need some encouragement, I encourage you to come and pray with our prayer team after the service. But time for our Bible reading.
Thanks, Matt. This morning our Bible reading is from the book of Micah in the Old Testament. And it's from verse 6, chapter 6, verse 6 through to verse 8. What can we bring to the Lord? Should we bring him burnt offerings? Should we bow before God Most High with offerings of yearling calves? Should we offer him thousands of rams and 10,000 rivers of olive oil? Should we sacrifice our firstborn children to pay for our sins? No. O people, the Lord has told you what is good. And this is what he requires of you: to do what is right, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. Let's may God bless this reading today as Renata comes and shares the word. And the kids are to go out now, I think.
Hello people, I'm Renata. I've been on the preaching team here for quite a while now, and today I'm going to be talking to you about what probably would be my favourite passage in the Bible if I was going to pick favourites. Today's passage is actually brought to you by the Dutch Reformed Church. Mostly I've been involved with Baptist churches, but for about 5 years through high school I was involved with a group called Calvinettes, which is a girls' club associated with the Dutch Reformed Church, along the same lines as Girls' Brigade Guides. So every Thursday night, I'd go along to this group in the church's activity hall. And as the night started, the leaders would open with a prayer, and then there'd be a cue for the group to respond to, which was Calvinettes, what does the Lord require of us? And the answer repeated every week for 5 years is to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with our God, Micah 6 verse 8. It would now be more than 15 years since I had anything to do with that group. But that verse is still constantly with me and influencing how I go about my life. Wherever I'm at in my relationship with God, whether things are going well or if I'm in a bad place, I can always work on doing justice. I can always work on loving kindness, and I can always work on walking humbly. For me, I find it a huge comfort to have that constant in my life, which I can practically apply to pretty much anything I do. Now, Micah is what's referred to as one of the minor prophets. Being a major prophet or a minor prophet had absolutely nothing to do with how important what they had to say was. It's just how long the book of what they said was. So Old Testaments who talked a lot are the major prophets, the ones who are concise are the minor prophets. To frame the situation Micah was speaking into, because it's often important to understand why people were saying the things they were saying if you want to get the point of it, I'm going to give you a bit of a run through of the history of Israel up to this point. The very, very brief form of the history of Israel is God selects some people and says, I choose you to be my special people. Don't do these things, those ones over there, don't do those are bad. If you don't do those, I will bless you and I'll make you awesome. And the people say, that sounds great. And you know what they do? They wander over here and it's like, oh, we did the bad things. And they come back to God who says, but okay, we can work around that. You can still be my chosen people. Just don't do the things from now on. We did the things again. This gets repeated a lot. The longer version of that is it starts with creation in the Garden of Eden. God creates the first people, Adam and Eve. He walks with them, he spends time with them, and he gives them one instruction. Don't eat the fruit of that tree, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So they eat it, and they introduce sin into the world. That gets them thrown out of the garden, and they end up in the world where they have to toil and labour for food and take up farming. They have a few kids, Cain and Abel, who grow up, and each of them brings an offering to God. Cain brings an offering of fruit, and Abel brings, the best portions of his flock. Abel's offering is received better. Cain kills Abel and introduces murder. As humankind multiplies, they fill the world with corruption and violence until God decided it was necessary to eliminate them via a flood. But one righteous man was around, Noah, who God warned of the flood and instructed to build a boat to save himself, his family, and a breeding pair of every animal so the world could be repopulated. A number of generations after this flood, God appears to a man named Abram and says, "I want you to leave your homeland and come to a land which I will show you. From you I'm going to make a great nation, and I will bless you." So Abram goes with his wife, and his nephew Lot follows along. They take a bit of a detour via Egypt because of a famine. And eventually they get to this new land and they set up tents. They have a few ups and downs, but they're there, they don't own it yet. God establishes a covenant with Abram, which includes changing his name to Abraham, which is what most of you will be more familiar with if you know who I'm talking about. And they pick up circumcision as the mark of the covenant of God with Abraham's family. Abraham has a son called Isaac. Isaac has twin sons, Esau and Jacob. Jacob tricks his slightly older brother out of his birthright and deceives his father in order to receive a blessing that should have belonged to Esau. Understandably, this causes a bit of family tension, and Jacob leaves for a bit. Where Jacob goes, he works 7 years to earn a wife, but is tricked into marrying the wrong woman and has to work another 7 years to get the one he wanted. The first wife is Leah, the second wife is Rachel. Eventually, Jacob and his wives and their children and servants return to his homeland. God renames Jacob Israel. And from his 12 sons, we eventually get the 12 tribes of the nation of Israel. So those sons are Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, Joseph, Benjamin, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, and Asher. Joseph annoys his brothers, basically by being a pretentious little twat. They fake his death and sell him as a slave, which is probably a bit harsh. He ends up in Egypt and eventually becomes the advisor to the Pharaoh, due to interpreting a dream the Pharaoh had, which predicted a time of plentiful harvests followed by a time of famine. They prepare Egypt for this, and as the famine spreads across the land, Joseph's brothers end up coming to Egypt to buy food. They don't recognise Joseph, but he knows who they are, and he actually arranges things to get Jacob, who is now Israel, and his descendants to Egypt, where they'll be able to eat and live. At this point, that's 70 people, not counting the ones who married into the family. They settle in a part of Egypt called Goshen, and they did quite well. But it is worth noting that as their occupation was being shepherds, and in Egypt, that's basically an abomination. So they got on all right, but they were never going to be very popular. They continue to live and multiply in Egypt, and it's around this point we start picking up a cultural identity of Israel as a people group rather than just a family. Egypt has a change of leadership, and the new Pharaoh isn't familiar with Joseph and is a bit concerned about this rapidly expanding group of people in his country. They start working the Israelites as slaves and eventually decide to do some population control by drowning any male Israelite babies in the Nile. One baby is placed in a basket in the water so that he doesn't drown, with the hope that somehow something might happen that will allow this child to live. Pharaoh's daughter sees the basket and has a servant go and retrieve it for her, and she adopts that child as her own son. She names him Moses. Moses grows up in Pharaoh's household, but one day he sees an Egyptian severely beating an Israelite. He does know that he's an Israelite, and he kills the Egyptian. He flees Egypt to avoid being killed for committing murder. The Pharaoh dies, and God calls Moses to lead the Israelites out of Egypt. Moses makes some excuses, but eventually he goes and talks to this new Pharaoh, who doesn't take it very well. It, in fact, takes 10 plagues from God to get Pharaoh going along. So those plagues are, we have all the water turning to blood, we have a plague of frogs, we have gnats, we have flies, we have livestock deaths, boils, hail, locusts, 3 days of darkness, and eventually the death of all the firstborn sons. Pharaoh eventually agrees that the Israelites can leave, which they do. God starts leading the Israelites to the land that he promised Abraham. And he's actually there physically with them, appearing as a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night, so they can see who they're following. While the people of Israel are following the visible presence of God, pretty much the second something doesn't seem to be going exactly to plan, they say, "This is terrible, we're all going to die, we would have been better off as slaves in Egypt." Still, God gives them chance after chance. They make themselves an idol to worship when Moses takes a bit too long getting God's instructions and laws for Israel. But they're given another chance. We have a second go at getting the commandments, and the people manage to behave themselves for a while. God gives them instructions for taking over the promised land and becoming a nation. But the people doubt, they go and look and they second guess what God's told them, and so they're told no man from that generation is going to make it into Israel. So there's a 40-year delay. Now, that in itself is pretty miraculous if you're familiar with the size of Israel. So I've actually been there through that area. Keeping a large group of people lost in that area for 40 years is spectacular. That they shouldn't have been able to stay lost accidentally. It's ridiculous that they should be lost there for that long. But they are. Eventually, the people who doubted die out and they finally take over the land but don't follow the instructions properly. They are established as a theocracy with God as the head of state and the priests running things. But they look at other countries and they decide they want a king. They think that's important. God tells them that it's a bad idea. He tells them that a king will cause problems and will tax them heavily, and that it's not part of the plan for them. But they insist, so a king is anointed. They start with Saul, who is followed by David. David's son Solomon builds the temple in Jerusalem, which becomes a permanent place of worship for God's people and was hugely important to their identity. And following on from Solomon, his son Rehoboam reigns for 3 years before there's a revolt and Israel is split in two. Rehoboam rules 2 tribes in the southern part, which is the kingdom of Judah, from Jerusalem, which is where the temple is, and the other 10 tribes become the northern kingdom of Israel, whose capital is Samaria, which, when you know your New Testament things, you'll hear about Samaritans quite a lot. That's where they come from. And the king there is Jeroboam. A few kings after this split is where Micah comes in. He's from a rural village in Judah, so not particularly well connected to the politics of the capital, but he was prophesying around the reigns of Jotham, Ahaz, and towards the end of his ministry, Hezekiah came in and brought some major religious reformations to try and get Judah back on track. The various kings had many faults. Ahaz was actually considered such an evil king that when he died, he wasn't allowed to be buried with the other kings of Judah. So the people Micah is talking to have had this identity as God's chosen people and as a nation, and they've been drifting away from it. They never did it that well to start with, but they're watching it crumble. And so Micah comes along, and what he's talking about in the book most of the time is he's predicting the fall of Samaria and the eventual fall of Judah because of the Israelites choosing not to follow God's laws. But alongside the destruction and, just telling people how wrong they've been, there is hope. There will be redemption and a rebuilding. There is a reminder of what God actually requires of people. So I'm going to read Micah 6, verses 6 to 8 from a different version, which is, "With what shall I come before the Lord and bow myself before God on high? Shall I come before him with burnt offerings, with year-old calves? Will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams, with 10,000s of rivers of oil? Shall I give my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? He has told you what is good. And what does the Lord require from you but to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God?" What I love about this is that the focus is being taken off the bad things people have done in the past, and it's being put onto the good things that they should be doing, that they could be doing. Why I feel this is important is it actually helps people break the cycle of being focused on sin and restriction. If you're in a bad place and feeling distant from God, obsessing over what you've done wrong and how you can possibly make up for it, or how you can make sure you absolutely never do those things again, can turn it into a task so big you never start because it's just too hard. But looking at the good things gives you a starting point to move forward from. While a complete overhaul of how you do things is a massive task, you only actually have to take one step at a time. You only have to do one thing that's just and fair. Do one thing that is kind. Do one thing that isn't focused on yourself. And then do another one. And then do another one. And then before long, you've formed a habit. God can work with you from where you are now. If you were in a bad place, that's all you need to do. Look at that one thing you can do, and do the one thing, and do the next thing. If you're in a good place, this can be a challenge to look deeper. What does it really mean for you to be doing justice in the time and place you currently live? What does loving kindness really look like? And what's the deal with being humble? Doing justice is actually part of the vision and direction we've decided our church will be following. Specifically from the vision and direction document, which was shown earlier, we say that we want to make the pursuit of justice an integral part of our community life and start a catalyst group to advocate within our community. Doing justice can mean the obvious things like advocacy and lobbying for social issues that we see, such as last year as a church, we and many other churches sent letters to members of Parliament asking them to make it a priority to address the lack of accommodation for victims of domestic violence, who are often trapped in abusive and unsafe situations simply because there's nowhere for them to go. Along with those letters were photos of the congregations showing how many people supported making this a priority. And as a church, we intend to do more of this. But doing justice can also mean doing little things, like choosing ethically produced products or avoiding brands that you know are exploiting people. It can mean being environmentally conscious because issues resulting from pollution and climate change and general recklessness disproportionately affect the poor. It can also mean looking behind issues rather than taking what you're told at face value so that you can find out what's really going on. Sometimes information provided about an issue, while technically truthful, can be hugely misleading. One example from a few months ago came regarding tax brackets and average income, where Scott Morrison was saying it was important to modify a few tax brackets to address tax creep, because if it wasn't done, then a person earning an average wage of $81,843 per year would be in the second highest tax bracket. Now, this is a little bit of a surprise to the 75% of Australians with incomes under $64,000 a year, but technically it's correct. How does that work? Well, where this comes in is a lot of people forget some high school maths, which is important for understanding statistics. That $81,000 a year figure is the mean average full-time wage. To get that, first you exclude the third of the workforce who are part-time or casual. Then you add up all of the incomes of the full-time workers, whether they're earning $40,000 a year in a factory or $20 million as a CEO, and divide that by the number of workers. So if we lined up 20 people along here and gave one of them $1 million, we could say that on average we've given them $50,000 each. Technically that's true. It's also useless, but it's true. Because the inconsistency between that highest data point, the 1 million, and the rest of the data points skews the results dramatically. Then there's the issue of the third of working Australians who aren't working full-time. Because if we include them in the mean average, that drops it to $62,000 a year. But that's still a mean average, which is not going to give you a great snapshot of how an average Australian is really doing. Fortunately, there's a better type of average to use for this, which is the median. That one is where you effectively line up all of the incomes from lowest to highest and pick the one that is exactly in the middle. Half of workers will be earning that much or more, half of workers will be earning that much or less. If we do that, we get $55,063 every year. But that's only employed Australians, so that's still not actually a good reference for what an average Australian is necessarily getting. What happens if we pick the median income just from people who filed tax returns? They've had income from somewhere to file a tax return but don't necessarily have a job. That puts us at $44,527. So that average wage of $81,000 a year, while technically truthful, is nearly double what is a normal income for Australians. Depending where that number is used, particularly if it gets picked up accidentally in discussions about housing affordability or healthcare or cost of living, that can have drastic consequences for vulnerable people due to masking the severity of a situation. So as a starting point for doing justice, advocate where it's needed. Do the little things. Something doesn't have to be hard for it to be worth doing. And look behind issues, because what's on the surface doesn't always really tell you what's going on. And to fix a problem, you need to find the cause, not just a symptom. Moving on to kindness. Be kind to people. Do nice things. Be polite. Offer help. Teach them new things. But there are a few things that people do when they're being kind which are not very helpful. And in order to demonstrate that, I'm going to pull up a volunteer, and I have picked Sam, who has no idea that he's doing this, but it is important that I have someone, you'll find out why that's important. Now, as quite a few of you would know, I make things. I have a degree in fine arts in furniture design. Mostly what I do, I describe as being a furniture artist doing that. I make sculptural furniture pieces, usually in carved timber. Mostly I work with animal forms in what I do, and it's not uncommon for dogs to try and pick fights with some of my work, which is hilarious. But I'm going to help my victim here learn to carve exactly the way I do it. The first step is the right tool for the job. Now, what we see here is a knife. Obviously, if you're carving with a knife, that's important. One very important thing is making sure that a knife is actually sharp enough for the job. Now, a lot of people would test that by shaving their arm a bit. I think that's actually a bit slack, to be honest. It's not real, you could do better. So what I find to be a good test is to hold a strand of hair under tension. Now, as soon as you touch that, it's going to break, usually. It's not very strong. But with a sharp knife, I can actually, that one was under too much tension, but I can shave a bit off to split that hair. That's what I expect of my knives. It's not a lot, I just like to be able to split hairs with them. So, we have the right tool for the job. And this is why we picked Sam, because he does a lot of cooking and plays with sharp knives a lot, so I trust him not to injure himself with it. The next step is having the right materials. So now we'll pick up what our volunteer here is going to be carving. This is something I've already started, which will make it a bit easier. Now, we're looking at hewn pine, which is a relatively easy wood for carving. I've started it so you can see what he's doing. So we've got the right tool and you've got the right materials. The next step is how to actually carve it. Now, this is really simple. This is exactly how I do it. Just carve off the bits that shouldn't be there. Look at the bit that's not chain and just get rid of it. Now, do you think what I've just said is going to help him? No? That's exactly how I do it. If you think back to those instructions I gave him, there is a very important word there. That word is just. When you're trying to teach someone something new or proposing a solution to a problem that they're struggling with, if you use the word just, you are missing something. Just signals that there is a bit of knowledge or skill or something in the way you think that you're taking for granted, and other people don't necessarily have that. Just can also signal that there is something in the surrounding circumstances which you haven't picked up on. You can put that down, you don't have to play with it now.
I don't want to break
You're done, no. It's fine. Yep, I'm done with you, you can go. But part of being kind is understanding that other people don't necessarily work the same way you do. And they don't necessarily work the same way you expect them to either. Even if you know they'll be different, they might not be different the way you expect. And part of being kind is factoring that into the way you help or teach. One thing that I didn't suggest about carving when Sam was up here, which most people would find quite a helpful thing to do, is to take a moment to visualise what you want to make. But if I'm trying to explain things the way I do them and not thinking about the way someone else might think, I'm going to miss that because I've got aphantasia, which means I don't generate mental images at all. Whatever I might try to picture about something in my mind, I can't ever actually see it. And at this point, for people in this room, there are two likely things that most of you have got with learning about people being wired differently. Probably most of you are going, what do you mean you can't do mental images? How can you be an artist if you can't do that? And may have just learned that not everyone can actually form mental pictures in their mind. A much smaller number of you may have just learned that the vast majority of people around you see things that aren't there and think that's perfectly normal. Usually for someone with aphantasia, that's the way you find out, is that you hear someone talking about aphantasia and you go, wait, that's not a figure of speech when people say picture this. You know, they're actually doing it. Now, a few other areas, which are more common ones, where these justs can get in the way, include extroverts trying to help introverts in social situations. It can include organised people trying to help disorganised people stop being made of pure chaos. Or healthy people trying to help people with chronic health issues or mental health issues. The introvert can't just go and start a conversation the same way the extrovert does. There's no just there. It's something that involves work. The disorganised person can't just make and follow a to-do list. Even if they really like making them, they're probably not, they're going to struggle to follow them. And a person with chronic illness can't just do the housework the way a healthy person can. Even something as simple as a phone call isn't always just that simple for someone. For someone with social anxiety, that one phone call might take several days to build up the nerve to make it, and it might be triggering panic attacks for days afterwards. To be kind, when you're offering help to people, try to replace the word just with a phrase like, have you tried? Or what I do is. Because those open up the space for a person to respond and say, that doesn't work for me because, I've tried that, it causes me problems. Or, can you explain that better? I don't understand how that works if they haven't tried it. It allows space to acknowledge that people don't work the same way you do. And finally, we're going to have a look at being humble. Being humble isn't thinking lowly of yourself. It's not talking down your skills. Australia has a bit of an issue with tall poppy syndrome. We tend to talk down both other people and ourselves. And that can be a very unhealthy thing because it can lead to undervaluing and eventually underusing valuable skills. Humility, the way I was taught, is having an honest understanding of what you do and what you know, and being okay with that, whatever that honest assessment might be. Now, the ironic thing about talking about humility is that it often effectively involves a speaker standing up and saying, look at this example of me being humble. It's a weird thing to draw attention to, but I'm going to do it anyway because that's sort of the easiest way of explaining things. I have been playing bass guitar in this church since 2005, and in my previous church in Burnie since 2002. Over that time, sometimes we've had several bass players on a roster regularly, sometimes it's just been me. And I have been playing bass guitar since before Mitch was even old enough to hold one. It's been one of the most consistent things I've done over the last 17 years, and I really enjoy doing it. And I can also very confidently tell you that at this point, Mitch is the better bass player in this church. That doesn't undervalue what I do or what I have done. That's just a case of making an honest assessment of skills. Mitch put in the work to develop good technique and to learn theory behind it. I reached a point where I had to choose whether I was going to focus my development on art or music, and I chose art. Part of walking humbly means being able to acknowledge and celebrate other people being better than you, not just at things you don't care about, but at the things you like doing and are actually important to you. Because being the best should never be part of your identity. If that's part of your identity, you've got a problem. On the flip side of that, when it comes to picking up a knife and carving a block of wood into a small animal or a length of chain, I am quite probably the best person in this room at doing that. Some of you might have some hidden skills you haven't pointed out, but it's a relatively fair statement for me to say I would be probably the best at doing that. Knowing that and acknowledging that is not at odds with being humble. Because while I describe my carving process as just removing the bits that aren't supposed to be there, there's a lot of skill and practice and talent involved in getting to the point of being able to just do that. Where that would become an issue with humility is if I was drawing my identity from being the best at that. If it would cause me a problem if someone walked in who was better at it than me. You know, if I wouldn't like that. Or if I started thinking I was better than anyone else in general because of my skill in a particular thing. Making an honest assessment of your skills and knowledge means recognising your strengths as well as your limitations. Because after all, if you can't acknowledge how good the things, if you can't acknowledge how good you are at the things you've got to offer, how can anyone else benefit from them if you don't recognise them yourself? To walk humbly with God, learn to make an honest assessment of your skills and of your limitations. Ask God to help you understand that and to guide you in using those skills and that knowledge well. Now, to finish up, I want to leave you with a bit of homework. Not a lot, because I don't know what all of your circumstances are, and I want everyone to have a fair chance of succeeding. This week, do one thing about justice. Maybe you'll see an incident happening and intervene. Maybe you'll buy fair trade coffee instead of your usual one. I don't know whether it's going to be a big thing or a small thing, but it'll be one thing. Then do one thing that's kind. It might be big, it might be small, but do one thing. And then find one person who is better than you at something that you think is important and tell them how great it is that they're good at it. Go up and say that physically. And make sure it's something you actually do with a reasonable level of competence and care about. Like, I'm not going to go and tell someone how great it is that they're better at running than me. I have exercise-induced asthma and a dodgy ankle. If they're not better at running me, there's probably health issues involved. There are probably plants that are better at running than me. There is nothing humble in acknowledging that someone is better at that. That's not important. Make sure it is genuine, what you're saying. And then look at some of the things you do and find one that you're good at. And actually say to yourself, I am genuinely good at whatever it happens to be. Take a moment to acknowledge it and recognise it, and think about how you can use it to benefit others. Thank you.